All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started. I want to thank all of you for being here and thank our panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. This conversation is the fifth roundtable discussion under the work that we launched some time ago on the future of America's cities and towns. I also want to welcome those who are joining us via live stream. We're here to talk about ways to ensure that the new Opportunity Zone provision works for the most fiscally stressed cities and towns. And for those who are unfamiliar with this effort, the Future of America's Cities and Towns, it's intended to bring attention to the fact that in periods of growth and in periods of decline, when there are programs available and sometimes when programs are a little thin, what we've seen in the last several decades is that many communities, despite what might be happening around us all, many communities continue to struggle and have had a difficult time making any headway in this current economy. I think of my own hometown of Flint, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a community that has struggled. And there are a good number of cities and towns across the country, large and small, that have had a difficult time making this transition. So we have some folks here today that will go a bit deeper on this subject matter, particularly around the way opportunity zones might work, and I think we'll all have an opportunity for some questions. We have Matt Josephs, the Senior Vice President of Local Initiative Support Corporation, LIST, an organization I've worked with for a long, long time in my previous life. Aaron Vetru, a Managing Director of the Center for Financial Markets at the Milken Institute, and Adam Looney, the Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets at Brookings, another organization that I've spent a good share of my past life working with. In some note, before I came to Congress, I was working on these issues of fiscally stressed communities, working on redevelopment challenges, particularly around vacant and abandoned property, starting in my hometown of Flint and then working across the country, largely on the belief that we all have an interest in helping make sure that the cities that we are trying to define here, these cities that are often left behind, are viewed properly, are viewed as communities that have real potential to contribute to our economy and to try to stop this narrative, which I think all too often overtakes this place, that these struggling, weak market, choose your euphemism, these cities that struggle are a problem to be managed, as opposed to communities that have people with the same aspirations everyone else has, and with great possibilities, with incredible opportunity. And so when the Opportunity Zone notion came along, immediately I thought, okay, this has some real possibilities, but what we don't want to see, and this is really the purpose of this conversation, is that it yet be another example when development tools are developed that they don't precisely fit the unique challenges in these places and actually have the negative impact of further leaving them behind. We're not saying that's the conclusion that we have drawn yet, but we want to make sure as we enter into this conversation about how opportunity zones will be implemented, that we're going into this eyes open, knowing that there is a subset of American cities that struggle, and also knowing that the federal government largely, and certainly in many cases state governments, have not tailored or customized or somehow aligned the programs that are intended to support development with the specific and unique challenges these places that I just described face. And I won't go deep on that because this conversation I think will cover it, but one area that I personally have some concern, and I'm hoping that the panelists will address and that we might get into with questions, is that the kinds of places we're talking about have really limited operational capacity in the public sector, and very often similar challenges across the nonprofit and private sector. And it's an issue that I think has to be addressed because the ability for a community to advantage itself of a program even such as this one, which is really largely private sector driven, the ability to take advantage of these programs and these opportunities is limited by the extreme austerity measures that are being imposed on some local communities. And my own personal experience says that if we don't deal with the issue of capacity, we could have a program that works in many places, but again leaves these struggling places behind. I want to ensure that doesn't happen. So without going much further, I want to start with, because I do have an agenda here that I'm intending to follow, with Matt Josephs from LISC. I know you have some slides. Yes. I think most folks have gotten them.
You all got a chance to grab the slides from out front. Excellent. So I've been charged with kind of giving the overview of the Opportunity Zones legislation and what's kind of the intent of the program. So good morning. I'm Matt Josephs. I'm Senior Vice President of Policy for LISC. Local Initiative Support Corporation. We're a national nonprofit housing and community development organization headquartered in New York, but we have local offices in 31 different markets throughout the country. We also have partnerships with rural community development corporations. 86 are in our network, serving 44 states and over 2,000 rural counties. And I see some familiar faces when I've been making the rounds on the Hill with our local offices to talk about our work. So we're generally excited about this opportunity, and it's going to be very hard to go through these presentations without using the word opportunity about a million times. But we are excited about the potential, also share some of the concerns the Congressman laid out. So let's talk a little about it. So this was the Opportunity Zones program was created in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that recently passed. It was based upon bipartisan legislation in the Senate that was pushed by Senators Scott and Booker, and here in the House by Congressman Teaberry and Kind, I believe. And portions of that legislation, not all of it, for better or worse, was pulled into this, but portions were, that created this Opportunity Zones initiative. So how this works, first of all, what is an opportunity zone? What are opportunity zones? The kind of, I think, neat thing about this program is it's up to the states to determine what they're going to designate as the opportunity zone. So it's a little different than other tax incentives like enterprise zones or renewal communities or promise zones, which were all competitions, but at the end of the day, the federal government picked which of these markets would get these designations. Here, the states are allowed to pick it. So there is some minimum qualifications of a qualifying opportunity zone. It has to be a census tract that has a poverty rate of greater than 20% or a median family income less than 80%. So they kind of borrowed that from the New Markets Tax Credit, which, by the way, a very successful program. All of your bosses should be supporting. So they use that kind of piggyback on that definition of low-income community, but told the states that of all those eligible low-income communities, you can pick up to 25% of them to submit to Treasury as a designated opportunity zone. There is a little bit of wiggle room that if an adjacent census tract doesn't quite qualify, that up to 5% of their designations can be those census tracts. So there is a little bit of some wiggle room beyond that, but they're generally low-income communities, and it's up to the state to determine what segment of them are going to form their zones. So we are to the point now, all the states have submitted their designations. Treasury has approved them for all 50 states, and I think 6 territories have now been approved by the Treasury Department. So what we're seeing now is that there's about 20% or plus are rural tracts, which I think is a good indication. We want to see a good mix of urban and rural, at least LISC certainly did. And we're seeing that on the whole, that the tracts tend to be a little higher in poverty, certainly lower in median family income than just the minimally required. So that's at least a good indication that on the whole, that's not to say there aren't going to be some exceptions out there with some census tracts that you kind of question. And I'm sure we'll talk about some that you maybe question, well, why was this one chosen? But on the whole, I was a little bit encouraged that these tracts seem to be trending to lower income, higher poverty, higher unemployment, so that maybe some of this capital will actually get directed to communities that really need the investments. An interesting thing about the legislation as well is that it picked up a new concept that wasn't actually contained within the original legislation, and that is that investors, if you want to claim this tax incentive, you can't just make investments directly into the projects on your own. You have to do it through opportunity funds. So these funds must be committed to dedicating at least 90% of all their assets will have to be invested into the opportunity zone. So they're basically set up for the purpose of investing in these zones, and Congress had given Treasury the role of certifying these opportunity funds Treasury has basically punted on doing substantive review of these funds. They put out a FAQ document saying that that investors will, or the funds will, in their tax forms, self-certify that they are an opportunity fund. Now, Treasury certainly should be and hopefully will be verifying that they're meeting all the requirements of being a fund after the fact, but they are not putting any kind of guardrails around the fund ahead of time, according to their FAQs. So these are the funds, they invest into the opportunity zone. So what's in it for the investor? Why does the investor want to invest in one of these opportunity funds? There's really three benefits. One is they can defer, so what investor would do if they have capital gains liabilities, the government would basically say, you don't have to pay those right away. You can defer what you owe us. So if you're an investor that put, that made $1 million on stock in Microsoft stock, for example, you would immediately owe the government about $230,000 in taxes on your capital gains if you're paying a rate of 23.8%. But the government's saying, well, you don't have to pay us that right away. If you invest that entire $1 million into an opportunity fund, then you don't have to pay for at least 5 years. You can defer it up to, we can actually defer it, according to the statute, up until December of 2026. So if you keep the funds in the opportunity fund for more than 5 years, then the government also says, well, we'll cut your tax bill by 10%. And if you keep it there beyond 7 years, up through 2026, you can take another 5% off that tax bill. So there's a nice benefit that you're deferring your gains and you're getting some of it reduced over time. So that's an incentive in and of itself to maybe invest in a fund, but the big benefit comes if you keep the funds there for over 10 years, then whatever gains you make on the opportunity fund investment, you don't owe any taxes on. So that's the real crux of where this program is going to really probably make or break the success. And there's positives and negatives to that we'll get into. So again, you have, if the timeline is that once you have your gains, like on that Microsoft stock, you have up to 180 days to defer it, to invest it into an opportunity fund. You do it for up to 5 years, you get the deferral. Past 5 years, you get a 10% tax break. Past 7 years, you get a 15% tax break. And then you keep it there for over 10 years, that long-term patient capital, and this is equity capital, mind you, then you won't have to pay gains on your whatever, taxes on whatever gains you get from the fund. Another benefit of this program, the eligible investments are really broad. It can be businesses, operating businesses, equipment. It can be real estate almost of any kind. So you can do affordable housing, you can do community facilities, you can do manufacturing, commercial, almost anything under the sun. Again, it does have to be an equity investment, and the other wrinkle is that the fund has to invest equity into the projects as well. So it's equity at both levels. So that's where it differs from new market tax credit, where you can put debt into a project and still claim the credit. So where are we now towards implementation? I mentioned all the opportunity zones have been designated and approved by the Treasury Department. They're available for public viewing on their website. The next step is implementation of the law. Treasury's put out some frequently asked questions that are very thin. They really need to provide a lot more guidance on what are the eligible investments, what's a qualifying business, that kind of activity. I think before investors might get really comfortable with making the investments, they're probably going to want to see these rules. I wouldn't expect to see them before the end of this year, maybe early next year. And then the investment activities will begin. I mean, I hear already of some groups that are setting up funds. I think like LISC is very interested in doing this, but we still need, there's a lot of dancing that needs to happen between the investors. We'd be getting projects aligned, waiting for the IRS rules before you can really set it in motion. So I think the investments really won't happen in earnest till next year. So quickly, I think the strengths of this are that there's the local designation of the opportunity zones. I thought that was a kind of cool wrinkle to this. The flexibility of the investments that can support almost any asset class. The one thing I didn't address that I think could be a huge strength is the idea of this new investor class coming into play. The idea is with capital gains, you have a lot of high net worth individuals that have these capital gains, and if they can steer some of their money, their investment dollars into these socially responsible investments, I think that could be huge. There's a huge potential. It's an uncapped credit, unlike new market tax credits, low income housing tax credits. This is uncapped, so there's potential for a lot of investment, but there's also some risks too, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And then frankly, this is actually much more of a straightforward investment opportunity when you compare with things like low-income housing tax credit in the market, which has a lot more compliance rules and a lot more penalties. This is a little more straightforward and easy to understand. As far as some of my concerns, at least, there is so far, it appears to be generally a lack of oversight from the federal government on this, at least with respect to certifying the opportunity funds. There are no kind of guardrails in place as a part, to steer investments into what is going to benefit the communities most, and that's where giving an uncapped credit is a disadvantage here, because the low-income housing tax credits in the markets are very competitive, and to do well and to get these credits, you have to make commitments to serving low-income communities, for example, and benefiting the residents, and none of that exists here. There's also a risk, I think, because of the nature of the incentive is to really reward the highest returns on investments after 10 years. I don't know, those are the investments that are going to really benefit the communities. So you might end up actually with more gentrification and displacement because of those kind of investments happening. It kind of overheats the market. And that's a concern. And then from a political perspective, personally, I also worry about some of the other proven credits, like the housing credit, particularly the new markets tax credit, which is going to expire in 2019 if it doesn't get made permanent, that someone's going to use this as an excuse. Say, oh, you don't need those credits anymore, you got this opportunity zones. And that's a whole other conversation, but that's certainly not the case, and I worry about that kind of perception. So that's my soapbox, that's how the program works.
That's a good, helpful tee up for the remainder of the conversation, and turn out Aaron for your comments, followed by Adam, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Representative. I'd say at the beginning of this, making sure that as many people as possible are aware of the opportunities is the exact thing that's actually needed today. And so my name is Aaron Bedrew. I'm the Managing Director for the Center for Financial Markets at the Milken Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think tank that's based here in Washington, D.C. Now, from our perspective, the flow of capital is just merely a means. It is not the end goal. The last thing that I want anyone to think is, just because money's flowing, everything is going to work out. That's not really the case. The end goal is for the average American to be able to have an opportunity, puns intended throughout this entire comments, where job growth happens, wealth accumulation happens, and economic independence happens. That's the end goal. Now, to make sure how we get there, we have to stand on what we already know. We already know a couple of things. One, the largest sector for job growth as a driver is the small business sector. You know that 2/3 of job growth come from that area. Roughly more than 90% of businesses in the U.S. are small businesses. We want them to not stay small, we want them to grow and hire. So figuring out how to make sure that that happens, leveraging the opportunity zones is a key thing. One of the things from our Access to Capital initiative that we had kind of unpacked a bit is when you look at the small business sector, the number one source of startup capital for a small business is usually friends and family. That's the first bucket. Everybody talks to your cousins, your aunts, and uses your own home equity effectively. The second is bank capital. Now, when you look at that being the national average, underserved markets, whether it be swaths in places in that part of Michigan where you reside, or Baltimore right in our backyard, or parts on the West Coast, the second source is actually credit cards. Very expensive, very costly in terms of what it actually strips away in terms of resources back in the community when you're paying off credit card processors on the different coasts rather than the money getting recycled back in the community. So when we're looking at opportunity zone capital, which right now it's being estimated something like $6.1 trillion of capital gains sitting on balance sheets from individuals and corporates, that amount of capital flowing into Americana is going to be one of the largest flows of capital into the U.S. With that type of opportunity, I think we have to ask ourselves, where is the value? And I think Matt's kind of highlights, and there's three that I want to just emphasize on. One, this is equity capital. Now, when we did our own assessment in this area, there is enough debt capital typically in places that it can absorb it, but patient capital that can help grow with a little bit more risk appetite, that is very much lacking, especially in low moderate income neighborhoods. And the second is that, in fact, this is targeting low and moderate income neighborhoods, those that are actually been taken out of the access to capital scenario. And the third thing is all these increasing carrots to make investors stick around for the long haul, for longer term rather than short term. Now, from these three perspectives, there's a lot of incentives that could be quite powerful for low and moderate income neighborhoods across the U.S. But the key thing we have to understand is this is This is a strategy at the top level. And I think every one of us has known that strategy is nothing without good execution. And therein lies where the risks are. And I'm going to only focus on two that I want to highlight. One that you brought up in terms of this, the balancing act that needs to happen between supporting real estate and infrastructure investments and small business job creation investments. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say we don't want any money to go into real estate and infrastructure. That's not true. There is a need for that real estate, commercial and residential investments to happen. But it needs to be balanced with the job creating side. You don't want communities to see their home income levels skyrocket to the point where they didn't have a job and their incomes didn't allow them to actually be able to stay in the neighborhoods that they grew up in. So finding that balance is going to be a key thing. And then the second thing that's really important to think about is, again, because this is equity, now as a financier, I would say one of the most important things people need to understand is there is something called a capital stack. Essentially, you need to have a proportional mix of debt and equity and other types of capital mixes in between hybrids. So with all of this equity coming in, what are we talking about? Is it literally selling everything and somebody else owning it? Or some of the original owners being able to have equity that they've given off and maybe debt coming in, finding that right balancing act, and essentially who's going to provide that debt? In most of these low-income neighborhoods, these have been quote-unquote banking deserts, where post-2008, a lot of the mid-size and large banks actually either A, moved out or shut down, and effectively have created this lack of access to the banking sector. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon when we think about, well, how to maximize the value if you're not having that debt piece that's also part of it. Now, in the spirit of trying to not just point out risks, but throw out some ideas, one that's on the local front and then one that's on the national front. On the local front, if you're trying to figure out essentially where to find that balancing act between real estate and small business, now I've been invited into a couple of different asset management firms that are trying to think around this. And I would tell you that there are folks that have put maps of the U.S. where the opportunity zones on their wall, and they've dubbed them, war rooms. Where are they going to go? And they're trying to figure out how, essentially they're so excited to invest back in American communities, but they're recognizing this is a strategy. There's still absorptive capacity issues that you brought up, and there's policies on the ground. There's issues of how to be able to identify these opportunities that I've started to now see certain cities step up and drop blighted assets into their own opportunity zones to say, here's a fast track mechanism in the investment that work for our own economic development strategy. And so trying to think of cities and states as being partners with opportunity funds such that they end up seeing capital go to where they want. That's a way to kind of make sure that it's a fast track for the type of development that you want, with a mix of both real estate and job creation. So I've seen some of those things, and there's been a couple of cities out there that have already created their own assets to be able to do that. That's on the notion. On the national front, on this mix between equity and debt is an interesting phenomenon. In most of these areas, if you look at, there was a study that was done by the Office of the Comptroller and Currency with NCIF, National Community Investment Fund, where they said, where are banks relative to low and moderate income neighborhoods, and what are they doing both in terms of deposits and lending? If I had a visual, I would show you a 2x2 chart that says the x-axis, if you called it, the proportion of a bank's deposits that it's taking from low-income neighborhoods, and then the y-axis, it is the percentage of lending that they give in low, moderate income neighborhoods. You always, on a 2x2, want to be in the top left quadrant, top right for you guys. Then you would want to, you would only see CDFI banks, which are certified by Treasury as 60% of their lending activity to go to low, moderate income neighborhoods, followed very closely by minority depository institutions, which in there are also a large number of them CDFIs. You would find in the bottom quartile, you find the top 10 banks, and then the average for all banks way down at the bottom. Essentially, banks are not serving these communities to begin with. Now, in the legislation, there are rules with regards to what type of businesses can receive this equity investment. Yes, there are the usual suspects, and that makes a lot of sense. No sin businesses, alcohol patronizing businesses. I was surprised to see massage parlor right next to a golf course as being a sin business that can't receive this. But aside from that, they also put in the mix no business that has more than 5% of its assets as a financial transaction. So essentially, any lending entity is barred from receiving these equity positions. And I get why there was that insight. Essentially, you don't want hedge funds and random financial institutions just sitting on all these investments. You want them, especially given post-2008 where we didn't see that capital move out. But I think it was a bit of an oversight to think about community development financial institutions, which is chartered by Treasury to make sure it deploys this capital. So if we want to find that right mix between debt and equity, thinking about exceptions within these CDFIs as being able to receive this capital so it does end up going into communities. Now, I'd say these are just two ideas. There's a lot of good ones that are floating around on how to realize the full potential of this. The group that's drove the getting this language included in the tax reform bill, the Economic Innovation Group, EIG, has been out there trying to cull good ideas, as well as the Milken Institute has submitted its own comment letter to the IRS, noting some of these and other things to help realize the full value of this. And I'll end with just kind of a final comment. I've gotten a couple folks to say, why is the Milken Institute interested in this? I'll say our chairman, Mike Milken, who's notable as kind of what he's done for the democratization of the fixed income bond sector. He often talks about when he was a grad student after the Watts riots in Los Angeles, where he grew up, where he was noticing essentially the lack of access to capital. And later on in grad school, he came up with a rather interesting equation. He said, look, if you start with the individual, their health, their education, their human capital, you add in rule of law, property rights, social capital, you add in real assets, land, minerals, the things that we start from to become productive. You take this entire thing and you inject financial access to capital, financial technology. This is how we get to shared prosperity. And so as a student, he was always thinking that this is kind of a critical thing. And from our perspective, as we look at opportunity zones and opportunity zone funds, this can be a huge potential for low, moderate income neighborhoods if we manage it appropriately and think about the right set of incentives and think about a balancing act for making sure the underserved populations are benefiting from it. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. That was great. Adam.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm Adam Lee. I'm an economist at Brookings. And so I was asked to talk a bit about how we can make sure that place-based investments like opportunity funds actually benefit the communities and the people that need it. And so I wanted to offer 4 suggestions, starting with some general ones and going into some specific ideas for opportunity zones, in particular to target the right places and to use the right data to do it, to put stronger guardrails on how the money is used, to monitor compliance and to mandate some transparency in how the program is working, and finally to evaluate whether these programs are actually working and whether they're better than the programs that we already have in place. So as a general rule, it's important to target place-based incentives towards places that are actually economically distressed. The obvious reason is that if you're trying to help people who are in economically distressed areas, you got to make sure that you're focused on those places. A less obvious reason is that the economic evidence suggests that the beneficial effects of place-based investments are much larger in distressed areas, but are basically non-existent in higher income areas. So in particular, evidence suggests that low-income housing tax credit investments have positive spillovers. They improve property values, reduce crime, create more economically diverse neighborhoods, but only in neighborhoods that are deeply impoverished. In the research, places where the median income is below like $26,000. So very, very low-income places. And there seem to be no such spillovers in higher-income neighborhoods. And targeting is also important for maximizing cost effectiveness. A major drag on the cost of place-based policies is crowd out. And that's when the government pays a subsidy for a building or for an investment that would have been built anyway, and thus crowds out private investment. In the example of LIHTC, the best estimates suggest that for every 5 low-income units we subsidize, 1 would have been built anyway. And so what that does is it drives up the cost of building new units by effectively 25%. But again, the evidence suggests that there's no crowd out in in more distressed neighborhoods, places where there's little new investment, where prices are not rising, ensure places that are not gentrifying. So targeting stagnant neighborhoods is really important for increasing the bang for the buck on these types of investments. And so targeting is one area where the federal government or states that work alongside opportunity zones could improve. Opportunity zones and many of the other place-based policies that we use are not highly targeted. Nationwide, 45% of all neighborhoods are qualified as low income. 57% of all neighborhoods in America could have been an opportunity zone. That gives states very broad authority to choose. And while some pick well, many do not. For instance, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, California did a really good job of picking the most distressed census tracts in their states. But places like Mississippi, West Virginia seem to have prioritized places that were not that distressed. Indeed, it seems like some of the selections that they made were less, or on average, were less distressed than low-income communities they did not pick. And so I think that's a sign that states had too much flexibility and that their incentives were not very aligned with Congress's goals for this program. The latest example was in Story County, Nevada, where clearly they had, where there was a county that was not qualified originally to be low income, but where the state came back and asked for the designation. It's a county that has a family poverty rate of 2.6%, 1,100 families, but it houses an industrial park that is home to Tesla's Gigafactory. And so clearly it was a case where they were lobbying to out of a desire to improve conditions for their investors, not for their poor residents. I don't mean to say that that was a typical example, but clearly it happened in just about every state to some extent. One solution is to raise the threshold for what qualifies as distressed. For instance, picking places that have higher poverty thresholds, reducing the ability to kind of choose contiguous but not low-income places. A second way to improve is to use better data. And I don't mean to be too wonkish about this, but Treasury used data that dates back to 2011, gave states the opportunity to use another round of data. We use a definition of poverty that includes college students. And so states picked places like the campus of USC, the campus of Penn State, Liberty University, Berkeley, University of Kansas, University of Illinois, Maryland. And those are just several of the states. Several of the examples where more than 90% of the residents are college students. So clearly that was not what Congress intended. And so I think that they should use more timely data. They should adjust it to remove the influence of people who are not actually poor, and to draw on other indications of distress like child poverty, educational attainment, housing prices, or housing investment. And we have a lot of new data sources that are coming online. Here there are places like Zillow that monitor transactions in real time. There's data maintained by the Postal Service on vacant properties in real time. And I think that Census is actually collaborating with researchers like Raj Teddy to come up with better fine geographic information that will be quite useful for projects like this. And so the point is that the federal criteria for this and for subsequent investments that the federal government provides, or that state governments are encouraged to provide, can really benefit from better targeting. My second comment was to think about having better guardrails or conditions on how states can use or opportunity funds can use the money. Clearly for low-income housing tax credits and for new market tax credits, we're very prescriptive in what the money can be used for. Low-income housing has to be used to build affordable housing. People who get to live there are low-income residents, and they're charged with specific rent. For new markets, it's a much more flexible system, but it still requires that the CDEs be accountable to the residents, have a mission of supporting the community, and there's an application process. So the CDFI-funded Treasury gets to put their thumb on the scale and say, like, the community health center or the daycare center or the development that includes those things gets a priority over somebody who just wants to build like luxury condos. So that helps direct it to investments that actually benefit the local constituents. And so in opportunity zones, there are no guardrails at the federal level. One can contemplate those in the future. And so I think it's really incumbent on states, localities, to help steer these funds. They have many tools at their disposal that they've used in the past, things like their zoning rules, local hiring requirements, property and other tax incentives, preservation funds, assistance for homeowners in those areas. And so I think that they can work alongside and within opportunity zones to help steer those projects to things that benefit their citizens. The third thing I was going to say was the focus on capital gains is kind of a strange choice and makes for some complexity. And it's an area where I think the federal government, it's incumbent on the federal government to monitor how these investments are being made to make sure that people are complying with the rules. For background, only about 6.5% of Americans actually pay capital gains taxes this year. That's because very few Americans actually have capital gains. Most people hold their investments in tax-exempt accounts. The statutory capital gains tax rate is 0 for most Americans. Like if you're making under $104,000, like you don't pay capital gains. And then we already have pretty generous provisions for real estate, for real investments in equipment, construction, real equipment, and software, for instance. And we have an exclusion on capital gains tax for investment in small business stock under Section 1202. And I feel like 1202 is a good example of, in some ways, a cautionary tale in that that's also an exclusion for small business stock that you hold for 5 years. Operates very similar to opportunity zones, but you get to use it wherever you want, not necessarily in a zone. And we really don't know who uses that provision. It's kind of a self-monitoring thing. When you realize the gain after 5 years, only then does the IRS know that you made the investment. Only then do we know how much it cost. Only then do we know how much people benefited. And so I think for opportunity funds, there's a danger that we'll have a similar circumstance where the opportunity funds will self-certify, they'll self-report what investments they make. 10 years from now, we'll learn how much income people are excluding, and only then, after 10 years, will we learn how much the program cost and what it was used for. So I think that's an opportunity for the government and the IRS and Treasury to take a stronger role of asking up front, what are people using the money for? Are they flowing to investments that we want them to flow to, that we intend for the program to do? Are people following the rules? And to that point, I think there's already changes in the program. Right now, we have a system where in 2026, a bunch of people are going to pay capital gains tax on income they have not realized. By and large, we do not ask people to do that. And then more generally, investments before 2020 follow the pattern that you described. But after 2020, it's kind of unclear, like, do you get 5 years step up? Do you get 7 years? What happens to investments after 2028? Because it doesn't seem like there's an end date for some of the benefits. And finally, and very briefly, is that there's a lot of people who are interested in opportunity zones. There's a lot of enthusiasm around them. Ultimately, though, we're not going to know whether they're cost effective and whether they're working unless we try to figure out if they're effective and evaluate them rigorously. At the end of the day, it's a tax expenditure that operates much like a spending program. It requires oversight from CDFI, from the IRS. It's plausible that it's costly, that it's ineffectual, or that it's regressive. And we won't really know unless we check. And we need to check whether it's better than things like new markets and the one-time housing tax credit. And so I think it's important to do up front. Otherwise, it's clearly going to be a popular program. So I think if we want to maintain the rigorous structure and make sure that it's achieving our goals, we really need to make sure up front that it's working the way we intended.
Excellent. This is a very good, I think, tee up to some of the challenges that we've been thinking about and sort of talking through as a result of all this. And I wonder if, I have a lot of questions, but I wonder if I might just start with this concern that each of you have articulated and I mentioned, and that is that there's a fairly substantial number of areas that qualify. States will make those determinations. But even after that, there will be a sort of stratification of these. It would seem that the initial capital will flow where the return is most solid and likely to be highest. I guess two questions. One, what thoughts do you have about, if you could go a little deeper in terms of how Congress might look at that question and potentially address it. The other question, and this I think relates in part to the work that I've done with LISC, is what role intermediaries might play in ensuring that as the funds are organized, that they're not all organized in a fashion that will absolutely maximize the return, but also dive deeper into these places that, as I described earlier, have all sorts of challenges, capital being a big piece of it, the operational challenges that they face. I'm worried about that we'll never get to the chicken and egg moment where investment will drive reestablishment of strong investment, public sector investment in the basic needs of civil society. That's a real risk here. So is there, within LISC, I assume some of the other natural organizations, has there been discussion about the establishment of funds in order to reach beyond just the highest return?
Yeah, so that's LISC's mission, right? We're a nonprofit, we're a certified CDFI. There's over 1,000 CDFIs that have been certified by the Treasury Department, and these are groups that have to have a mission of working in low-income communities and steer, at least 60% of their capital into those neighborhoods where it support low-income people. So I think from this network, there is a great starting point for the investors that if you really are interested in mission-based investments, you're willing to take less of a return than you would get for investing in that luxury housing, but you're going to invest in projects that really benefit the communities. There's a whole network of folks out there looking to do the right thing with the money. This is just one of many out there, but that's the role we plan to play. Some of the foundations, I don't want to short. I think it was Rockefeller and Ford have put out kind of money out there for mission-related groups to put together plans. I think they put $25 million out there to support these kind of investments and setting up the funds that are really going to benefit the mission-driven investors. So there's absolutely a role out there to play, but just then again, there's going to be a lot of other investors that are just seeing this as an opportunity to increase the bottom line, and you'd like to think that investments will, at the end of the day, benefit the community residents in a really positive way, but there are no, Treasury's not putting kind of any guardrails around that. And that's a missed opportunity.
And I guess one concern, maybe you could address this as part of your question, am I overly concerned that there's a limited amount of capital that's going to move into this space, and that it will tend toward higher return opportunities? We're going to use that word over. Or is it likely that the zones and all the opportunity that comes with them will be fully invested, and we won't have to make those choices?
I mean, there is quite a lot of capital that's looking at it. I actually know of a number of funds that are already up, irrespective of the IRS guidelines not actually being set, that they are looking at different investments. Now, the key thing to think about is when you create an investment vehicle, it is about economies of scale. Having a $10 million or $50 million does not make sense for them. They want to be much, much larger. And when you're that much larger, doing $1 million deal is the same amount of effort as doing $100 million or $1 billion transaction. And so then what are the opportunities that satisfy them in being able to get there? And at the end of the day, when we say returns, these are expected returns. So what your return is, multiplied by your probability of not getting it or getting it. And I think therein is where intermediaries play a very powerful role. Both the example that I gave in terms of certain cities saying, we're going to make it easier for you to do these investments in the type of things that make the economic return more palatable for us, but also will give you the return that we need. So I don't think it's a question of going after their return and saying take less of return. It's going after the risk side, and making the process by which they can execute their transactions easier for them for the type of deals we want. And I've heard I was in a meeting yesterday with a mayor that said, do we need an opportunity zone czar that helps make sure that it goes to the communities and the different types of investments. Those type of engagement and facilitate, make sure the capital goes in the areas that they want is a critical one. And then the other one, what we discussed in terms of the CDFIs. The CDFIs have been in these communities and know where the opportunities are. They've been banking them. And so it's an interesting thing to think about when we say, how do we have capital sitting with the ones that are most absorptive, ability to grow, hire more? You want to make sure that that conduit is actually put in a bit of a driver's seat. Right now it's not. unless it itself is an opportunity zone fund, which is plausible. But again, that we're losing that years of experience that the CDFI sector has. Now, you'll find some folks talk about, well, wait a second, the whole point of this is equity investing. Aren't CDFIs nonprofits, and how do I get an exit with a nonprofit? That's not true. There are many different types of CDFIs. There are some that are for-profit, there are some that are nonprofit, there are some that are deposit-taking institutions, there are some that are loan funds, credit unions. There's a wide swath of these. And I don't think we have to jerry-rig where the value goes to and where the capital goes. Let the investor figure that out based off of it. And clearly, no investor is going to give equity to a nonprofit and hoping that it'll get an enterprise value on the back end. That's not the objective. But there are for-profit, deposit-taking ones, and that's a critical thing to think about here. I didn't mention this earlier. Imagine a scenario where we actually do have value being created, jobs being created. Where do these new assets and where do these new deposits then sit? If you don't have deposit-taking banks still in Flint, Michigan to be able to take this, they'll go, counties over that have no responsibility to reinvest back into those communities. You almost want that multiplier effect to be there in the communities to take those new deposits. And we're missing that opportunity again.
It's one of the things that when the program was first, it's not really a program, when the opportunity was first laid out, it was clear that it was not an intention to create a program around this, that it was essentially saying, look, this is the new structure within the code, take advantage of it. But it does beg this question. There are clearly going to be ways to optimize this tool. And I'm just curious about what we should be thinking about in that space. Maybe not within opportunity zones themselves, but maybe a parallel program that does ensure that we're delivering this tool to the places with greatest need with the other aspects. Your point about communities that are most ready, it seems to me there are a couple of things we ought to be encouraging. One, no surprise for those who know me, encouraging the development of public or nonprofit land banks to prepare land for the market so that the absorption is more readily available. My experience in real estate development taught me one thing for sure: time kills all deals, and we can't get these places ready to go. And then the other piece of that is a concept that a lot of us have been working on for a long time, and that's helping distressed communities become redevelopment ready. Very often, it's not just the access of marketable title to land, but the process of getting development approvals just through the normal municipal government process sometimes is just a bridge too far, and we need to address it. Those are programs that would potentially make this work better. I'd love to have a comment on that, but I wanted Adam to drill down a little bit further on this issue of data, because in committee hearing rooms like this, very often we scrutinize federal policy. We have to scrutinize that from some basis of understanding. So in 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, what information under the current structure would Congress have at its disposal to evaluate the efficacy of this approach, and what would we best have in our hands?
You will have a lot of useful information. So the census will continue to on an annual basis, provide updates on poverty rates, employment, child poverty rates, health insurance number, things like that at the local level. So you'll see how this will evolve. Those are in some ways lagging measures. So it takes a long time. We're now only getting information that dates from 2012 to 2016. I think from
that's more downstream data, but uptake data.
Well, so I think that if you want to get after it, it's not clear that you're going to have it automatically. So people are going to self-certify that they're an opportunity fund. Their investors, I think, are going to, when they roll over gains, are going to certify that they roll those into an investment fund. You're not going to have, I think, necessarily a tabulation of things like what kind of funds that money went to, how many dollars were in those funds. There's not intrinsically going to be a measure of what kind of projects are being invested in. So I don't think there's reporting, for instance, on those funds. And they'll be kind of scattering with the other corporate and partnership information. So I think those are kind of things we'd love to know how it's going, how many dollars are being invested, and where it's going to. think that would be helpful to understand how it was operating when they started up.
So I have that comment, but I want to, after that, open it up and ask anybody with a question, please make sure don't leave with any questions unanswered. And if you could, raise your hand and I'll try to point you out. Identify yourself, where you're from, if you're a member, who it is, an organization, who that is. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
so just to that point real quick, there could be that kind of reporting. There's nothing stopping Treasury from getting that. As a matter of fact, the original Investing in Opportunity Act had whole sets of data that they said to be collected, not just for compliance, but really to determine program outcomes. And it's things like what kind of jobs are getting created, what, you know, in addition to all the other things you said. So I think that's really important. That was in the conference report, so Treasury certainly could have taken language from that report and said, okay, there's a sense of Congress, we need to collect this. And it's not too late. We're encouraging the Treasury Department in these self-certification forms that they've still yet to create. Let the people know that you want to collect this data, that there is a price to pay for getting these kind of benefits in the tax code. And minimally, we want to know where the investments are going so we can, over time, see if it's really working, what kind of improvements do we need to make to the next iteration. So I think it's not too late.
Questions? Yes, in the back.
My name is Aristotle Jones, work for the Urban Institute. My question is, how do you create and sustain the political and moral will to invest in opportunity zones when we as a country tend to put profit and prestige over people, and we also tend to use our exterior bootstraps? So how are we going to implement that political will and moral will when we have these two entities holding people back saying, well, I get it, you can do it too? So, is that what you meant?
Fire away.
Yeah,
That was wrong, round robin.
Yeah.
In my experience, like working, I've been at LISC now for 6 years. I was actually at the CDFI Fund in the Treasury Department for 13 years before that, and I've been working in multiple administrations, some of which would have a viewpoint about, that people need to help themselves. But I think at some level, I don't see those as as opposed, right? I think that some might have the philosophy that folks need to help themselves, but I think at the end of the day, everyone knows that you can't lift yourself up from the bootstraps if you don't have boots to begin with, and that maybe there's a role that the government needs to play to make sure that everyone has the bare necessities they need to get these investments. And there's no arguing that these are underinvested communities, and that I think these kind of incentives, I think are, and you saw the legislation itself was very bipartisan. That there is a need when you get Senator Booker and Senator Scott on the Senate side saying this is what we need in the communities. I think there's a sense that there more needs to be done, and I don't think people are going to get the question, hopefully not question about the motivations or the abilities of the people in the communities to kind of lift themselves up. I think there's a play here for both sides.
Yeah, if I could just comment, I will say this: the reason that I'm intrigued by this, you got to come up with another word, opportunity, this possibility, is that it does address one very significant problem that distressed, impoverished communities face. But my bigger overarching concern is that there will be a number of communities still left behind, because there is a tendency within the public sector for sure, and unfortunately I think it spans the ideological spectrum, to view very distressed communities as having produced their own distress. In very challenged populations who often lack access to the economy because of the lack of skills that simply are not in their possession, essentially blaming those folks for the position that they find themselves in. And the purpose for launching this Future of America Cities and Towns initiative that I began quite a number of months ago is to try to rip the cover off what's happening in these places and help folks understand that a community like Flint didn't decide to become a community like Flint. It was almost all external. And the fact that the city is facing, near bankruptcy on a regular basis is not because of bad management. It's because they've lost half the population, lost 2/3 of the wealth, and a lot of that was driven by external factors over which they had absolutely no control. It's nice for us to think we have control, and if you're a mayor, you want to think you have control. The truth of the matter is we don't. So when I see this opportunity, I do think there's great merit in it, but I think it will have disproportionate impact based on the capacity of those places and the capacity of the people who live there. And we can't ignore that and assume that moving capital only, it's important, but moving capital only is going to be a panacea for places that have structural problems that have to be addressed. And I don't want us to think somehow that this is the silver bullet that will solve the problem. It is potentially a good resource, but it only can work, I think, if it's coupled with other human investments in human capital. And in the most significant area that's not often discussed is the operational capacity of municipal government to actually provide the basic elements of a civil society. We have a lot of communities that just are struggling in that space. And this chicken and egg question is the one that I worry most about, because if the belief is that capital moving into these distressed places is going to naturally develop greater capacity on the ground, there's a lag in that capacity being developed, and I worry that we will end up with winners and losers.
Yeah, no, so at the Milken Institute, we launched this partnership for lending in underserved markets, a collaboration between the Lions team and the Small Business Capital Access effort to mobilize money to underserved small businesses, in particular looking at minority-owned small businesses. And this point around, lifting yourself up by the bootstraps as being the only metric. One of the things we kind of looked at in terms of why we needed to focus on this, yes, there's bias that's in the space. There is bias. Minority business owner walking into a bank probably will get a business card 4 out of 10 times versus 8 out of 10 times for a non-minority. In terms of just getting, proving what your personal assets are, I think minority business owner 6 out of 10 times is required to provide proof, while it's only 20% for a non-minority. So with these biases existing, of course we can't say lift yourself by your bootstraps. What we're talking about in the possibilities being equitable access to the tools to be able to do it. Because the end goal of having an equal opportunity to the American dream is only going to come with equal access to the tools to get there. And I agree with you that that is going to be a key part of this. One positive is this is targeted at communities that have been disadvantaged with the low and moderate income communities, but we have to make sure through some of the data tracking, but also the balancing act between the real estate versus job creation component. And again, it's not one or the other. I think it's both, but finding that right balance. And intermediaries are going to be a key part of this, as well as local civic leaders, and making sure that they're being prudent in terms of how they deploy that capital.
We have a few minutes. We'll take some questions, try to give quick answers. I really appreciate all your participation. We just don't want to hold folks longer than necessary.
Nigel Griswold, I'm Managing Director and an economist at Dynamometrics, a research and technology firm in Detroit, Michigan. 2 questions. One is a policy structure question. And so the opportunity zones, is it a one-shot deal? Like they got picked and these are the ones we're sticking with for the whole duration? Or is there another bite at the apple? Or is that possible to legislate with maybe more refined focus? So that's a question about policy structure. Because the investment's going to change that zone. Maybe it turns into not what it was before. And so there's that. And then on the evaluation front, just thinking about with Treasury, what's the window for evaluation metrics? So if you wanted to go, instead of census tract, work with those communities and go parcel level, time series, get the real-time data and actually track, geolocate those investments, track those investments and watch how the micro area changes over time. Could you propose that or put that to Treasury, and what's the time window to actually put that in?
So the first question I thought was that it's one and done, so they need new legislation to revise the zones if they want to change them. And so the ones in place are going to be in place for 10 years at least. On the second question, there is some opportunity. It's a little bit harder. For light tech, you know the address of the building. And so we kind of can do the geolocation and see what happens in the surrounding area. There's not intrinsically that sort of structure here, and so it's not obvious that, well, there's not intrinsically going to be any reporting. I think if you ask, maybe you could ask for maybe you could ask for the specific address or a specific location and figure that out. The other thing to say is the census tracts are, well, depending on which state you're in, are often very small. So in Detroit, people know that it's blocks. Not true in Montana, say, but you know a little bit.
Yeah, and there are some anomalies in census tracts as well. We have one that's really frustrating. Again, I'm from Flint. The largest, best opportunity census tract is one that is the former Buick city sites. It's right in the middle of the city, and it's completely surrounded by eligible census tracts. But it itself does not have a single person living in it. And so it does not qualify even as an adjacent tract, sadly.
I thought that those,
I mean, that's been, we've been running the traps on this, and we'd hoped that there would be a way to qualify it. But the only reason I mention it is that when I see Nigel, I think of other anomalies, census tract anomalies. I remember when I first saw the initial data, I met Nigel first when he was a grad student at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, which shows up as the most impoverished tract, or one of them does, in the state, which obviously doesn't make any sense, to your point about what happens when you just rely solely on data. It does seem to me that it would be beneficial to look at some of these technical questions, even if we don't want to go down the policy path and rewrite this thing, to take a look at some of the technical questions and deal with some of these anomalies to make sure that we're actually targeting where we should be. Okay. We have right here.
Hi, my name is Tony Cross with Congresswoman Deming's office, Florida 10. I appreciate how y'all took the time to address the risks seriously associated with projects like this, especially the risk of increased gentrification really concerns me. But I'm wondering how we can codify oversight into this program. You mentioned an oversight czar, for example, but where would that come from? Would that come from Congress? Would that come from local governments? How can we codify that oversight?
So I would say that, it's interesting that that again in the conference report language, a lot of this came up during the negotiation of legislation. There was actually something in there that said that the Treasury Department should certify the opportunity funds like they allocate the new market tax credits to CDEs. Now, I think that was probably a misuse of wording. They probably meant as they certify the CDEs, but if they truly meant the allocating of the credits, that would suggest a competition, that you have to make all these commitments to serving low-income communities and serve low-income residents to score better in the competition. We're not advocating for that. I don't think that's what Congress meant, but there is an in-between space we've been arguing for that we think the Treasury currently has the authority to do, which is to at least find out from these opportunity funds what kind of impacts you hope to achieve in your community. We're going to build affordable housing. It's going to be affordable low-income people. We're going to invest in community facilities that are benefiting the residents. We're going to create jobs for community residents. We're going to have commitments to do that. They could commit to these kind of things, just check off a box, and then years down the road, they would have to maybe report back, did they achieve these goals? That's a minimum effort that Treasury could have done, and they've chosen not to do that. So I don't even know that that requires anything more than some more browbeating, but maybe Congress does need to say, no, we meant this, and you need to do this. But again, the window is going to be closing so quickly because these funds are going to get certified. The highest incentive for investments are in that first year in 2019. And so, I don't know if we have a lot of time and space to really create those kind of incentives in.
So last question, so maybe incorporate any last word you might want to put in.
Sure. I was just going to say that I think that is a real risk, and I think that we won't have a lot of oversight over the funds themselves. So I think that, we've been describing funds as if we're like a real estate investment fund or a mutual fund. I think the reality is that a developer would just, they operate through partnerships anyway, they'll just designate the partnership an opportunity fund, self-certified, they'll be done. And then anything that flows with the partnership, as long as it's in the qualified zone, the opportunity zone, will meet the requirements. And so I think that there's kind of no guardrails at that level. So I think it's really incumbent on the states and the localities if they want to police these. And so if there is in DC and then just have read every city rules about what you can build and what you can't build. And DC, one I'm most familiar with is one where they really have a negotiation about. And so those are the types of guardrails that you would have to impose.
And they could also, just real quick, they could also offer carrots to investors. They could create a new twin credit, for example, twin tax benefit that you can only claim if you're investing in higher impact. So now that'll help level the playing field. Or they could steer resources that way, home dollars, CDBG dollars, to really support the lower income benefits type projects or qualified allocation plans for the housing.
Yeah, no, these are exactly the points I was going to make. I think at the federal level, we have to be cognizant of exactly from an investor's perspective. If they've already gone out there, got investors to go into the fund and realize, the different points of what Matt discussed. There is the investor, there is the opportunity zone fund, and then there are the investments. The different taxable treatments are at the original investor level. The fund has nothing to do with it, other than to make sure that 90% goes into an opportunity zone. So from an investor's perspective, I've committed this capital for 10 years to get all of these different benefits, and now you're going to add these extra requirements on me. You're going to see a lot of backlash not to have a Treasury-led effort or congressional-led effort. But that's where essentially all the folks in this room, your different members, your staffs, your different districts, that's where we think about between carrots and sticks of saying, if we want capital to go into these areas and we're going to make it easier for you to do that, these might be some of the things we ask you to track for us while you're doing it. And I think that's where we just work with how actual capital works. So capital is kind of like water. It follows the path of least resistance. Make it least resistant in the areas that you want, but capture some of the information that we have. It is a one and done thing, but if we don't have that data to be able to say, what did this actual thing do for us, we won't be able to recreate if it was such a good thing to do it again. And therein lies kind of the biggest missed opportunity.
It's a good word to end on. Look, I know there are a lot of hands that went up. I appreciate that. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Consider this the beginning of a conversation that will be ongoing. And just to remind you, this is part of a series of discussions that we've launched. We will have more. In fact, we're planning more of these conversations on various aspects of the challenge, particularly from the federal government perspective, that really weak market communities face. The next one will be in Camden, New Jersey, next month, the 9th.
Yeah,
Coming right up. And for those of you that work with members or even in communities, we are trying to do as many of these conversations in concert with colleagues in the House. So if you think of a particular aspect of the challenge that's not being addressed and would like to host, either in district or here in DC, another one of the series of discussions, reach out to my staff and we'll get to work on it. So again, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And the panelists, thank you so much. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you.